Warning, this episode is particularly graphic and disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Please be sure to tune in to the end of this episode for an important message from me. The depravities of humankind, abuse, murder, pedophilia, they are very good at making you lose faith in the human race. However, nothing really turns your stomach quite like eating your fellow human. Charisma and charm can conceal the most twisted of lovers. Catherine Knight grew up in Australia in an abusive household, and in school, she took out her anger on her classmates and was known for her tantrums, but also for her academic excellency, though her interests stretched beyond book smarts. She found joy in the slaughterhouse, where she was hired to butcher meat and where she enjoyed watching the pigs be slaughtered. Catherine, it seems, was also obsessed with love of some sort, but was violent towards her lovers and children over the years. After many failed relationships, Catherine met John Price. Catherine and John shared a mutual affection, that is, until he refused to marry her, sending her into a rage. On February 29, 2000, John came home to find the children were at a sleepover, and he was home alone with Catherine. That night, after John fell asleep, Catherine began stabbing John with a butcher knife. She wounded him a total of 37 times before he attempted to escape, only to be dragged back into the house and stabbed another 36 times. When John didn't show up for work the next day, the police came knocking, and what they found was a bloodbath. Catherine lay comatose on the floor after ingesting a large amount of pills underneath the skin of John, which was hanging from a hook in the ceiling. Portions of John's body were found cooking on the stove and set out on plates with vegetables, a meal she had intended to serve to his children when they returned home. Later in court, she pled guilty, but showed no remorse for her actions and was the first woman in Australia sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In today's world, we can go online to find a date or a meal or maybe a little bit of both. Rottenburg, Germany native Armin Maives discovered the joys of an online community. He even worked as a computer engineer, but with the internet, he also made his darkest desires a reality. Since adolescence, Armin harbored the secret desire to consume human flesh, so he posted an ad to an online cannibal fetishism site in March of 2001, saying he was searching for a young, well-built man, a victim willing to be eaten. Of course, you'd think no one would have replied. However, surprisingly, he got a response from a 43-year-old man named Bernd Brandis. On March 9, 2001, the two met at Armin's isolated house and had sex before Bernd insisted Armin must eat him alive. Bernd drank alcohol and took sleeping pills to numb the pain before Armin severed his penis and cooked it before deciding it was too chewy. Armin eventually stabbed Bernd, ending his life, then cut him into edible-sized pieces to be consumed. Armin was arrested in December of 2002 and was subsequently the first person in Germany to be charged with murder for sexual satisfaction, for which he served 8 years in prison. Several sources report that he has since become a vegetarian. A chef who cooked much more than a typical meal. From the outside, Dawn and David Viennes seemed like a happily married couple. They owned and ran the Time Contemporary Cafe out of Long Beach, California, where he was the chef and she a hostess. But behind closed doors, their relationship was far from ideal. Dawn allegedly drank from morning to evening and did cocaine, and David, a former drug ring leader, was abusive to the point Dawn feared for her life. In October of 2009, she began stashing money away in hopes of leaving David, but before she could run, things turned deadly. During an argument, David became infuriated with Dawn, so he bound and gagged her before going to bed and found her the next morning dead. She had choked on her own vomit. Dawn was reported missing by a friend, but police learned the truth when David's daughter, Angelique, approached the authorities. Angelique told police her father confessed to killing Dawn during a drunken conversation and claimed that her body would never be found, as he'd simmered it in a 55-gallon drum for 4 days in the very restaurant they ran together before disposing of it. When David found out his daughter had turned on him, he leapt over the edge of an 80-foot cliff, but survived the fall, where police apprehended him. Police searched for Dawn's body, but no part of her was ever found. During his trial, David represented himself, claiming he'd lied to his daughter and police about cooking and killing Dawn, but he was still sentenced to 15 years to life in prison in 2012. A mistake in the psychiatric care system sets a killer loose. Peter Bryan, a London native, was in and out of psychiatric facilities following his first crime, the murder of 20-year-old Nisha Sheth, who he bludgeoned to death with a hammer. Psychiatric professionals diagnosed Peter with paranoid schizophrenia, but felt he was improving. However, this progress, it seemed, was all a ruse. In 2004, Peter was cleared to live as an outpatient, where he would be monitored by psychiatrists, but ultimately allowed to roam free. Within hours of obtaining his freedom, he'd purchased a hammer, a screwdriver, and a knife, and forced his way into his friend Brian Cherry's apartment. Inside, Peter bashed Brian's head in with the hammer, then used the knife to sever his friend's limbs. Police were alerted by neighbors about the noise and stormed the apartment, where they found Peter cooking Brian's brain in a frying pan covered with blood. While in Broadmoor Hospital awaiting his trial, he killed another resident, 60-year-old Richard Loudwell, beating and strangling him to death before he was pulled away, and Peter admitted later he would have eaten Richard if he'd had more time. Subsequent investigations revealed Peter was not only a schizophrenic, but a skilled manipulator, and had an uncanny ability to appear mentally stable, even to trained professionals. The psychiatric facilities were partially at fault, too. His case had mistakenly been assigned to both an inexperienced social worker and psychiatrist who had never worked with convicted criminals, a mistake that proved deadly. Peter pled guilty in 2005. When the violent fiction of a narcissist turns into a brutal, horrific reality. Jose Luis Calva suffered a traumatic, abusive, and fatherless childhood and had a lot to overcome as an adult, but it seemed from the outside that he had. He wrote from his home in Mexico, mostly horror stories and poems that he used to charm the local women, one of whom he married and had 2 children with. However, his wife divorced him and jetted for America with his children, leaving Jose alone. He sank into a deep depression, turning to alcohol and cocaine to numb the emotional turmoil, and consequently, his writing career suffered. But he still knew how to write his way into a woman's heart, which was how he met both Veronica Martinez and Alejandra Galeana. Unfortunately, Veronica Martinez turned up dead and mutilated, and while Jose admitted to having sex with her, he denied any part in her death. Police had no evidence against him and let him go. But then he met Alejandra, who subsequently stopped showing up for work. In October 2007, police raided Jose's home, hoping to find Alejandra safe, but instead found Jose sitting at the table, eating meat seasoned with lime, with more cooking on the stove. Jose attempted to jump out of the window and severely injured his head before he was apprehended. It was then police discovered a severed arm and leg in his refrigerator and realized Jose had been cooking and eating human flesh. Authorities found the dismembered remains of Alejandra in the closet. She'd been strangled with shoelaces. Jose tried to say an alcohol and cocaine-fueled rage was behind the murder, but police found an unfinished novel of Jose's called Cannibal Instincts in his apartment, suggesting the murder had been premeditated. The Mexico City court found him guilty of 2 counts of murder, and he was to serve 84 years in prison, but was found hanging from a belt in his prison cell in December of that same year. His death was ruled a suicide. Proof that those with overly violent tendencies should probably remain behind bars. Alexander Spetsitsev lived a life of violence. He was tortured and abused by his father as a child and later murdered his girlfriend, a crime that landed him in a psychiatric facility. But treatment didn't seem to help. After Alexander's release, he resided in an apartment with his mother, Ludmila, where neighbors often complained of a foul odor coming from their flat. When police finally investigated the apartment, they were shocked and sickened at what they found. Body parts butchered and mutilated throughout the home, and 15-year-old Olga Galtseva dying on the couch after being stabbed. She told authorities she and two friends were helping Ludmila carry groceries into the house when they were trapped by a vicious Doberman. Alexander then beat and raped all three girls before killing two of them. One he fed to his dog, and the other he chopped up and cooked in a soup before force-feeding it to Olga. After further investigation, police found Alexander's diary where he documented the details of a total of 19 murders with the help of his mother to lure in children and dispose of the bodies afterward. He bragged that he'd killed upwards of 80 people, but this couldn't be proven by police. His trial concluded him insane and had him committed to a psychiatric hospital, while his mother was sentenced to 13 years in prison for her involvement. When the honeymoon period is over, things can get rather messy. 23-year-old Omeima Nelson was born in Egypt, but her childhood there was anything but happy. She was circumcised at a young age and working as a prostitute in her teens before she began a modeling career that brought her to the United States. It was there in 1991, at the age of 23, she met 53-year-old California pilot William Nelson, and the two fell for one another hard and fast, marrying just days after meeting. It was on their honeymoon that Omeima claimed that the sexual and physical abuse started. Just a month after their meeting on Thanksgiving Day, Omeima says William attacked her, and in self-defense she began stabbing him with a pair of scissors, then clubbed him with a clothing iron before he finally succumbed to his injuries. There is contradictory evidence that suggests Omeima tied William up before he died, but it was what she did next that disturbed investigators, perhaps most of all. Omeima castrated William with the scissors, then skinned and dismembered his body, boiled his head and hands to mutilate his fingerprints, and then she allegedly ate his ribs with barbecue sauce and Thanksgiving leftovers. Neighbors complained of hearing the garbage disposal running all night and the sounds of chopping into the early hours of the morning. Authorities found larger portions of William stuffed into trash bags, with 130 pounds of his body, about half of his weight, missing. Omeima was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, which earned her a 27-year life sentence. She was denied parole in both 2006 and 2011 and won't be eligible again until 2026. A woman, her husband, and his mistress go on a killing spree. Brazilian college professor Jorge Negromonte not only struggled with hearing voices in his head, but also with the fact he and his wife Isabel couldn't have children. That's when 24-year-old Bruna Cristina da Silva entered his life, a mistress who offered the possibility of offspring. But Jorge got much more than he bargained for when it came to Bruna. She was not only an alleged witch, but she believed that if Jorge, Isabel, and herself were to cleanse the world of uneducated mothers and prevent the birth of more thieves and lowlifes, they would be forgiven for their sins and be rewarded for it by a higher being. Jorge stopped taking his medication shortly before luring the trio's first victim, 17-year-old Jessica Pereira, into their home. It was there in May of 2008 they murdered Jessica and butchered her body before cooking it and feeding it to her 18-month-old baby the next day. They subsequently adopted the child into their unconventional family. Unfortunately, Jessica wasn't the last victim. After came Gisele Helena da Silva, who admitted to Bruna that she was violent towards her children, and Alexandra Falcao, who was brought into their home under the pretense of babysitting. Both women killed, butchered, and eaten. The family occasionally made the meat into street food that they sold for a profit, but were apprehended after Bruna was caught using one of the victims' credit cards. Bruna and Isabel received 20 years apiece for their part in the crime, while Jorge was to serve 23 years behind bars. Even though he only has flashbulb memories of the murders, he knows he's where he belongs, saying, "For people to be safe, I need to be in here." And that for him, human flesh was no different than a cut of beef. Australia's worst killing spree extended far beyond simple murder. Between 1992 and 1999, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlasakis had a total body count of 12 victims between them, all of whom were tortured. They were beaten, electrocuted, burned, and forced to call their captors God or Master. It wasn't until the perpetrator's arrest did authorities learn the horrific fate of the final victim, 24-year-old David Johnson, James's half-brother. James lured David to an abandoned bank where his partners, John and Robert, were waiting. David was ambushed, handcuffed, and then tortured before being strangled with his own belt. They cut up his body and stuffed it into a barrel, save for a portion of his right thigh, which they cooked in a frying pan before consuming it and feeding it to an unsuspecting friend, telling him it was wombat meat. The killers considered their actions justified by their prejudice against the mentally disabled, gay, obese, or pedophiles, and claimed they were doing society a favor by killing them. John, the leader, was sentenced to 11 life sentences, while Robert was charged with 10, and James had 4 life terms, all of them without a chance for parole. A killer who used his city as hunting grounds to track down his young, defenseless prey. Joachim Kroll was born in Germany, only one of 9 children, where he grew to be an awkward adult. He often wet the bed, only received a 3rd-grade education, and had an IQ of 76. He lost his father to World War II and was raised by his mother until her death in 1955. The same year, he began his criminal career as a killer. Nervous around women but sexually frustrated, he turned to non-consensual acts. He strangled and raped 19-year-old Irmgard Strell, followed by 12-year-old Erika Schulitter the following year, and Clara Tesmer in 1959. But after tasting the flesh of his 4th victim, 16-year-old Manuela Knott, he progressed to cannibalism. Joachim remained at large for 20 years, and the city of Duisburg became his hunting ground. He came to be known as the Duisburg Cannibal. He ambushed his victims before choking or stabbing them to death, and often had intercourse with the body before mutilating it with the intent of eating it later. In 1976, he was finally captured, and the full extent of his horrific crimes came to light. On July 3rd, police were led to Kroll's apartment by a neighbor who claimed that their waste pipe was being blocked by what Kroll had described simply as guts. Authorities entered the apartment horrified to find the hand of 4-year-old Marion Ketter still cooking on the stove, and her entrails and lungs stuffed into a waste pipe. In custody, he confessed to 14 murders in gruesome detail, delighted by the attention, saying he cannibalized his victims because he was trying to save on food expenses. He was convicted of 8 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder and charged with a life sentence in 1982. He passed away in 1991 from a heart attack while still behind bars. Thank you very much for watching. A number of you have commented on previous videos claiming that YouTube has somehow unsubscribed you from my channel. This isn't something I particularly like, so I would really enjoy if you would go down below this video and be sure that you're subscribed. But also, you can click on the little gear button down there next to the subscribe button, and you can choose to have notifications for whenever I upload a video. And that way you shouldn't miss any of my future videos. Thank you for watching. Check out my last episode on horrifying unsolved Girl Scout murders. Press on screen now or press the link below this video to watch. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to my channel because you won't want to miss what's next. And I'll see you next Wednesday.